Gay, bisexual, transgender, transsexual or LGBT plus Management Forum is introducing the South African Workplace Equality Index, or SAWEI, into the workplace. This is a prominent benchmark index in which employers can measure their levels of LGBT plus inclusiveness. This will not only be the first of its kind in South Africa, but also in the Middle East. The index has been implemented in countries such as the USA, Canada, the UK, Hong Kong, and Australia. Joining us now is Teveshan Kuni from the LGBT plus Management Forum to talk to us more about this important index. Good morning to you. Thank you so much for coming through.
Good morning, and thank you for having us.
Now, let's just first look at the status quo. Why the need for this index here in South Africa?
What we're finding for large companies in South Africa and large corporates, and that's where we're focusing for the moment, is that quite often human resource teams, diversity and inclusiveness teams, and employment equity teams don't have the necessary information or toolkits on the LGBT plus community to understand how to properly cater for their workplace needs. If you put this into numbers, something in the region of 10 to 15% of the greater population identifies somewhere within the LGBT plus spectrum. And if you apply that to the workforce in these large organizations of some of the larger banks, for instance, in South Africa have 30,000 employees, then you realize that there's actually quite an affected workforce who don't necessarily have the proper workplace programs, policies, and behavioral methodologies to make it an inclusive environment for LGBT plus people.
But what's lacking? Why are we still sitting here and discussing this, whereas we have one of the best constitutions here that protects the LGBTI communities?
I think in many ways the fact that if you look at large corporate South Africa, apart from maybe some of the law firms and consulting businesses, in large listed businesses there aren't any openly proud LGBT CEOs and prominent business people that we can reference as being, hey, they've made it. And that just says that either people aren't openly out and proud about it, and that says a lot.
Or maybe it's about societal discrimination.
Or societal discrimination, or the fact that there's a glass ceiling somewhere that's not spoken of. South Africa is a very Christian conservative society, and we understand that LGBT plus people face a lot of challenges within our society, even though we have a very liberal constitution.
Talking about that glass ceiling, in your view, do you think the LGBTI community is still being discriminated against, perhaps, when it comes to certain opportunities in the workplace?
What we're seeing is that quite often there aren't sufficient benchmarks and protections and policies within companies to either give people the necessary information to understand the community, or there aren't necessarily role models within that organization that help LGBT people aspire to being their authentic selves in the workplace, without having to create a double persona of this is who I am at work and this is who I am in my personal life.
That's true.
We're not asking for LGBT people to out themselves. We're just saying, if you choose to live a more open existence in your workplace,
do it.
Do it, and the workplace should be able to cater for it.
Yeah. And the truth of the matter is, you do get people. I was looking at some of my friends on Facebook who are openly gay here in Gauteng, but when they go back home to your deepest rural areas, they really have to go back to who their parents know as. And I think the problem really lies within your rural areas. Are you also perhaps targeting your rural areas?
So when we talk about large corporate South Africa, we sometimes just think there's a Santon bias, and a liberal Santon bias. Large corporate South Africa are companies that have branches in small towns. They have businesses in small towns, and a large part of their workforce is outside of that liberal Santon bubble.
Yeah.
So when we're measuring how these large companies are doing in putting in place these policies and programs, one of the things we also want to see is how widely it disseminates. So is it a head office policy, or is it a lived experience in even the smallest town and subsidiary or branch of that organization?
And obviously, as I said on my introduction, that we've seen this index, of course, being implemented abroad, like in the USA and the UK as well. How efficient has it been in those countries?
It becomes very efficient and very competitive. Companies want to be at the top. They want the highest rating. They know that it's a war for talent out there, and they want the best talent for the organization. They know that the modern workforce is far more open-minded and liberal in their approach to diversity and inclusiveness, and this is a way for them to celebrate their LGBT plus employees. And it also dovetails nicely into the employment equity plans, because they're going, well, we're tackling a wider gamut of employment equity, not just the the race and gender traditional aspects that are usually a focus of it.
So the Equality Index will be launched on the 17th of May, of course, which falls on International Day Against Homophobia and Transphobia. So I think this was intentional.
Yes, it was intentional.
Yeah.
And the reason behind that is because we want to use it as a tool to celebrate the change we're trying to drive within corporate South Africa. We're finding a lot of human resource teams and diversity and inclusiveness teams and employment equity teams are thirsty for the kind of knowledge around how do they rate, how great is their organization in terms of LGBT plus rights. Quite often these companies operate across the African continent, and in some jurisdictions LGBT rights are discriminated against legally, and teams don't know how to tackle that aspect. So there's a lot of real pitfalls that human resource teams are trying to understand, trying to uncover and trying to work on. This is going to be a very big toolkit for companies and those teams to be able to.
No, certainly. But how do they go about taking part? I know that there are questions to be asked, but how do they go about, participating in this index?
So they can go to our website, which is lgbtforum.org, and we've got quite a nice little how-to guide on there. But it's quite simply a short format survey. And what we're going to do is ask companies to answer the questions on the survey, where necessary, provide us with the necessary documents. That goes to an independent panel. We've got 2 academics, 1 prominent business person, and 1 activist to form our panel. They'll independently review all of the information that's provided by the companies so that it's objective, and then help them be ranked in terms of where they place. Companies can be anonymous, so if they're nervous about if they'll rate poorly and now that they may be seen because of that, they can be anonymous, but they will get given feedback about where they rank, either in absolute terms and also relative to their peers.
Well, interesting. We'll leave it at that. Thank you so much for coming through.